Hello, and welcome to the Grow Places podcast, where we explore the virtuous circle of people, growth, and place. Brought to you by Grow Places and hosted by our founder, Tom Larsson.
Faisal, thank you very much for joining me today. How are you?
Likewise, delighted to be here. Great to see you again.
Good. Yeah, good to see you. I'm going to jump in with a question straight away. So, for you, real estate, venture capital, why Pi Labs? Why does that all come together for you?
Actually, sometimes you have to look back at your own journey to understand why this makes so much sense. But just to go back to my childhood, I actually come from a real estate family. A lot of people don't know that, but my dad himself was a developer and a builder. So I kind of grew up listening to, you could say, real estate lingo around the dinner and breakfast table. So I was never interested in going into traditional real estate, but I ended up in California for university, and I worked in tech in Los Angeles, and so I was just fascinated with tech innovation and just everything you could do, how you could harness tech to improve business. And when I ended up here in London, I was working closely with James Caan, who was one of the dragons at the time on Dragon's Den, and we were developing a strategy about, it was post-GFC around 2009, we were developing a strategy to back real estate entrepreneurs. And at that point, it all started to make sense to me. So I was in venture capital. I found myself in venture capital following a master's at Oxford. We were looking at real estate as a sector. We were looking at new ideas within the space. I already kind of knew enough about real estate through my family roots. I was fascinated with tech. So I kind of just I connected the dots, and I combined these different segments of my experience, my tech experience from California, my real estate roots, and the work I was doing with James Caan to find and back real estate entrepreneurs. And I developed a whole new thesis that nobody was thinking about, which was around tech startups that are going to transform the built world, and became the first investor in the space.
Yeah, fascinating. Well, before we actually knew each other personally, I was aware of you exactly through that connection through watching Dragon's Den, James, and then there was a piece on the two of you, I remember, in the media at one time, and then it transpires that we connected with each other, and so how do you see that? Because you say you were the first in the space. I don't think the terms Contech and PropTech maybe were even
didn't exist,
well known then. So how do you see that landscape then? How has it matured, and where do you kind of see it going?
Yeah, well, at the time, just to set the context, we're talking about around 2013 is when I first started to dabble and look at some of the early tech startups emerging within the space. At that point, I had no fund, and Pi Labs had not been formed yet, so I had no choice but to part with some personal capital as an angel. So I wrote, some of the first checks personally into some of the early PropTech startups. At that point, the term had not been coined yet. I believe in some piece that I was either interviewed for or that was written about me, I used the term for the first time. It rolled off my tongue because at that point, fintech was a big term, and fintech is now obviously a global category, but at that point, London was very much seen as a hub for fintech. It was growing in the shadows of the financial sector over in the city, and Old Street was called the Silicon Roundabout, and the term is not being used anymore. So at that point, with fintech kind of being front of mind for a lot of people, I just said PropTech, and it kind of clicked, and it, more people started to pay attention, and the sector has transformed a lot, right, since then. We've been doing this for now over 10 years, and I often say to people, there's been a couple of different tech waves. So if I look at some of the early investments I made as an angel before even setting up Pi Labs, a lot of what was exciting at the time was tech-enabled, you could say, brokers and agents. People were trying to come up with online estate agents. So I backed one of the first online estate agents that arose in the UK called eMove. I then backed the first digital mortgage broker a company called Trussell, which then eventually exited to a U.S. company. And I also was the first investor in a company called Hubble, which was trying to create a digital commercial real estate broker. So that brokers was where it was at back in the, you could say 2013, 14, that first era. And then when I launched PiLabs Fund 1, we started to see big data and data analytics as a theme that was emerging. So we backed a company called Land Tech. So this is a platform that a lot of real estate developers use to conduct due diligence on development opportunities. So Fund 1 kind of capitalized on the big data wave and captured it just because of the timing and the vintage of that fund. It was a 2015 vintage. By the time our second fund came around, which was 2017, SaaS, there were a lot of SaaS models emerging. SaaS became a big thing across the world. And we invested in quite a few software as a service companies where the customer was ultimately a real estate business, be it a developer or a construction company or a real estate owner. And by the time if you then fast forward a few years, when we launched our third fund, which is the fund we're currently investing out of, Fund 3, there was a whole range of different themes that were emerging, because as the tech sector became more sophisticated, you had SaaS startups continue to emerge. So we focused on and invested in quite a few SaaS businesses. But then a couple of years ago, the metaverse became a thing that people were focusing on. Of course, Facebook changed its name to Meta. That drew the attention of a lot of investors. So we made some VR and AR investments out of that fund as well. Robotics has something that has become more sophisticated over the last couple of years. We're backed a couple of robotics businesses. Of course, drone technology emerged. We've invested in some drone businesses. So the breadth of what we're investing now, the range of what we're investing now has just become broader, much broader over the years than what we initially saw 10 years ago, which were kind of the first wave of digitalizing brokerage in some way. And once again, tech trends have changed again. Post GPT, the world has changed dramatically, and happy to share my thoughts on that as well.
Yeah. No, I'd love to get into that as well with you. I don't think we can go a podcast without talking about AI and GPT, so we must do that. But before we do, and you've kind of mapped it out there, but something I'd observed or read a little bit about is that, as you say, the kind of tech adoption curve is the sort of low hanging fruit is where the kind of energy tends to go first. And historically that's not been real estate, because the sector itself has been seen as, quite big and multifaceted and complicated.
Yeah.
But then within the sector, once people have dived in, as you say, this kind of SaaS models, the kind of software models is the sort of low-hanging fruit within the sector, moving towards more real-world solutions, whether it's robotics or Internet of Things or other things like that. So by the sounds of it, as you've moved through your funds, you're kind of tackling more of the kind of meatier, complicated, real-world problems as it goes. So how do you see that kind of evolving?
Yeah, so our positioning in the market as an early-stage fund is that we're backing what we say is cutting edge and next generation technology. We're not afraid to go in super early before the business has a fully fine-tuned product. We can go in before the startup has any revenue. So, and we have an accelerator program that's set up for that. We've been running it for 10 years. And through that program, we've backed very embryonic businesses in robotics, in drones, in IoT. And so, yes, we are trying to look at the opportunity set quite holistically. I don't think real estate is just one thing. So just within real estate, there's all the different food groups. There's offices, there's retail, there's industrial, and then there's the alternatives, there's medical real estate and so on. And data centers. And that's just the food groups within real estate. But if you take a look at the value chain, you have the investors, you have the investment managers, you have the capital allocators, you have developers, you have construction firms, you have structural engineers, you have architecture firms, and then you have, of course, infrastructure, which is a whole kind of adjacent category of real estate, and it's starting to merge with real estate in many ways. into a broader category people are calling real assets. So that's actually, even though we're a domain-focused and thematic investor, there's a lot to go after. And then if you start looking at all the different technologies within it, right? Even AI is just so nuanced, right? Within AI, there's computer vision, there's machine learning, there's now agentic AI, there's AI assistants, what people are calling AI co-pilots. We've backed a lot of those different types of AI startups, and then if you look at the timeline of AI, there's pre-GPT AI, which we've been backing for many, many years, and now there's all the new LLM native startups that are emerging that really are harnessing the power of one of these new LLM, the new LLM infrastructure, which is a whole new wave of startup emerging. So there's actually a lot to go after, and it's a lot more nuanced and complex than the term real estate or PropTech, which just overly simplifies it.
Yeah, absolutely. And so within that that world, there's a lot of noise, and you're trying to kind of pick your way through that. And I know that the terminology around kind of like vision statements, problem statements, kind of is very kind of popular, isn't it, within startup decks and your accelerator program? I'm sure you're kind of like trying to define problems quite clearly. Yeah. Although the landscape's changing and shifting, do you feel like the problems are changing and shifting since when you started to now? Or do you feel like some of those big problems are kind of consistent, and it's maybe just the ways that people are going about solving them?
I think they keep shifting. Like, we have this ecosystem where on one side we have our LPs, and our LPs are usually a real estate owner, developer, construction firm, investment manager. And on the other side, we have the startups that are building the tech that are trying to solve those problems. And what we're doing on an ongoing basis is just having discussions with these partners, these LPs of ours, and understanding their problem statements. And a construction firm will have different problem statements to, let's say, a developer, and a developer will have different problem statements to an investor, and so forth. So we're trying to collate all these problem statements. And that's kind of what I would call top-down, trying to come up with the investment themes that we should go after based on what the customer is saying. But then you can't ignore bottom-up. The bottom-up is basically looking at the 4,000 business plans that land on our desks every year, because that gives us it puts our fingertips on the pulse of innovation, in the sense that we get inside the heads of the entrepreneurs, and it's really important to think about what's on their minds. What are they building? They sometimes come at things completely laterally, and from a having not having any baggage in terms of any experience with the industry. A lot of the founders are actually not from the industry, and they come at it with completely lateral and creative perspectives that may be from other adjacent industries. So it's important to go bottom up and just look at the business plans. And the other way we think about the themes is we have in-house research, where we conduct research and we write papers, and we do the horizon scanning and market mapping. And to give you examples of papers we've written, our next paper is on data centers and all the technology that surrounds data centers. In fact, we've recently announced our first investment within this space. It's a company called Fluix that's using AI to help data centers reduce their energy consumption, which is hugely topical. So what we're researching, we're often investing in. So I often like to say that we research what we invest in, and we also invest in what we research. So the two go hand in hand. And another paper we have coming up soon in April is all focused on this new wave of AI startup, the LLM powered ones, and all the use cases within the real estate sectors. We're going to try to unpiece that, because we're very actively investing within that space. And I think the research will just kind of complement and strengthen our investment thesis for AI.
Yeah. No, well, I'll ask you about the LLM piece in a second. But just before we do, I want to, what you were describing there reminded me of a question that I asked James Pellet on the podcast Digital Trees. Obviously, I know he works with you.
Yes.
As well, and I asked him a question. I said, if you asked the same question to a C-suite CEO in a REIT, and to one of your accelerator founders about, what are the problems does each of them face, and what's the kind of opportunity, what answer do you think they would give? And so I'm going to ask you the same question.
I think that you'd get very different answers. I think it depends on the type of founder, actually. So there are certain founder teams where one founder is the commercial founder, and he or she comes from the industry, and they have faced this problem firsthand, and they decided to quit their job and set up a startup to tackle it. And their co-founder is the technical founder who's building the tech. There's, it's a classic CEO, CTO duo. In those cases, I think you'll get the same answer. You may not get the same answer because the C-suite real estate C-suite CEO is so high up in the organization that they kind of have an aerial view of what's happening, but they're not granular enough, right? And the person that ends up being the founder of these startups is probably like 4 rungs down, and usually 4 rungs down. And they're closer to the coalface and closer to the challenges and the problems that are being faced. So I would say you are going to get different answers. The nature of the founder within the startups that we're seeing is usually somebody who is closer to the problem than a CEO of a C-suite real estate company would be.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Interesting. Just for information, James's answer to that was slightly different.
Was it?
He said if you asked them both, they would both say that the other isn't listening to me.
Yeah.
Was his kind of sort of nuanced answer on it.
Yeah. Well, listen, James got a lot of experience in interfacing between the real estate owner, decision makers, and the startups that are trying to deploy and implement their technology within the real estate firms.
Yeah. So let's for instance, let's stay within the kind of the innovator's headspace for the minute then, because that's something that you're uniquely positioned really to think about, and then let's maybe sort of broach this the AI LLM piece. Kind of what was that mindset, what's that enthusiasm, what's that vision kind of coming out? Obviously everyone's got a different theme, but what's that energy directed towards when it comes to real estate and technology at the moment?
For AI?
Yeah, around the AI piece and what
I'm finding is that there, 10 years ago and even 5 years ago, you had this wave of startups that emerged within this domain. Call it whatever you want to call it, built world tech. This is pre-GPT, and many of those startups have done well. Some haven't done so well. What we're seeing now in the last 12 to 18 months is that there's a whole new generation of startups that are emerging that are built on the new LLMs and the new AI infrastructure. And because of the power of the technology that they're built on, they're gaining commercial traction a lot faster than the generation of startups that came before them. So we haven't seen this yet, but what I suspect is going to happen is a lot of the new startups that we're now backing may unseat the incumbents from like 5 or 10 years ago, because those companies won't be fast enough to adopt LLMs and completely change their tech architecture and the infrastructure they're built on. And in terms of where we're seeing these types of startups, we're actually seeing a new LLM native startup emerge for just about every use case within real estate. To give you an example, we recently announced an investment in a company called Genya, and Genya is using LLMs to turn architectural drawings into structural drawings. And obviously, with your own professional training, know that architectural drawings on their own take like weeks to create, and then you hand it over to a structural engineering firm, and they take another couple of weeks. And structural drawings are all about calculating the load and the weight and how much steel and how much concrete needs to go in and to hold up the building. but it's quite algorithmic, and the AI can actually do this for you. So if the AI can get accurate enough, such that the structural engineering phase of the overall works shrinks from 3 weeks down to a day, that's going to just save a lot of time for new buildings to be built. So that's one use case. That's one that we've already invested. Another use case that we're currently diligencing, we haven't made an investment, is on the investment acquisition side. So when you're buying some real estate, you end up with a data room with all the docs that your analyst needs to evaluate in order for you to decide whether you're going to make the investment and make the bid. This particular startup has built a AI co-pilot for the investment team, which will go into the data room, conduct the diligence for you, give you the red flag report, come up with your DD questionnaire, and then start writing your investment memo. Which obviously saves a lot of time for real estate investment teams. Probably eventually, as the technology improves, becomes agentic, can probably replace an analyst. So we're seeing kind of use cases across the value chain, which is super exciting. I see this phase in tech history as like a whole new renaissance of new AI startups emerging to tackle just about every problem that exists. And we're very happy to be set up as an early stage fund, because we're perfectly positioned to capture it. A late stage fund can't touch this stuff because it's too embryonic and doesn't have the revenue metrics, whereas we can go in right at ground zero, which is super exciting.
Yeah, no, it's super exciting, and I'm super excited about the whole space. I just think, as you say, this is the biggest thing, since sliced bread, shall we say. It's definitely, bigger than the internet in my view, probably electricity or something, it's seismic what's going on at the moment. And with that, it's obviously going to be really exciting, and a lot of disruption comes with that. But so, most of the listeners to this at the moment are what you would class as probably traditional built environment people. Obviously, hopefully after this, we gain some more listeners from the startup space. But so in that world that you've just described, which I completely agree with, what if anything is the kind of value, the things to kind of hold on to focus on of the traditional companies, whether it's, the in-person interactions or whatever you think that might be? Because obviously everyone's got to get on board with adopting AI or die. Fully believe in that, but what are those things which are going to remain human in this?
Yeah, I think probably like commercial judgment will still be valued. However, as AI becomes more agentic and goes beyond just being a co-pilot, with a lot of data, you can probably formulate pretty sound commercial judgment as well. So I think that then it makes me think it's actually the relationship building, the trust, the face-to-face interaction, the feeling good about doing a deal with the other party, building partnerships, shaking hands, all that human interaction stuff, the stuff that requires EQ. That's the bit that's going to remain super important. But I think anything that's process driven and mathematical and can be calculated, I'm guessing as the AI gets more and more sophisticated, the AI will probably do better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I agree. And just maybe then in the real world tech space, whether it's more the Contech or robotics, Internet of Things, those kind of spaces, are there any kind of examples that really come to mind about products that are amazing?
Listen, we backed robotics is interesting because robotic startups have been around for a while. There's actually an article in Sifted, which is FT's tech publication, I think from last year, talking about how Europe was particularly well positioned for robotics because of its manufacturing base. Germany, as an example, has a very world-class manufacturing base. And then now with all the AI researchers and AI graduates that we have in Europe, when you combine the two, robotics becomes more interesting, because there was like pre-GPT robotics and then there's post-GPT robotics, and it's about to get a lot more sophisticated. So we have backed a couple of robotics businesses. We have an investment in a startup called Okibo, which has built a robot that can paint and plaster walls faster than humans, without the health and safety issues, and can work 24/7. It's being piloted on a number of construction sites in the US and in Germany. And once these pilots are delivered successfully, and the product becomes more sophisticated, then I could see something like this being completely a disruptive technology.
Yeah, I remember seeing that one when I was on your mentorship program.
Exactly, yeah.
And,
And the thing is, it takes years sometimes for these startups to get out of that early R&D phase,
Yeah.
and to finally commercialize. And this has been through a long R&D phase, and now they have a robot that's ready to commercialize, and that's just super exciting to see. Yeah, and then we've done that in robotics. We've done a few others in drones. We recently backed a company called Sorair, which is using drones and AI, and the AI I'm talking about is computer vision AI, for security purposes. So large, you could say, warehouse facilities, ports, and critical infrastructure have quite high security costs. You need to have a patrol on site, and you need to have a control center where you're looking at what's happening on the estate. You have people patrolling regularly, but actually a lot of that cost can be curtailed through using military grade security drones. So that's a company we're backed for critical infrastructure and warehouses.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, Faisal, I could talk to you about this stuff all day, but I'm just going to sort of end with one question, which is, forgive me, like a lot of my questions, they're actually quite big and quite broad, but
Yeah.
you can try and put it down into a kind of
Sure.
pithy answer. But if you were to think about some of the barriers to adoption, barriers to innovation within the real estate industry, and you were to then have maybe one call to action to the industry to try and sort of ease some of that and enable some of this innovation, what would you kind of say?
Yeah, I think innovation is a process, and ultimately, I'm not going to go through all the 12 steps, but ultimately you need to be, not be too risk averse, and understand that in order to embrace innovation, you need to embrace a bit of failure. So have a piloting program where you can scan a bunch of startups and then decide which one or two you'd like to pilot with. Establish some clear KPIs as to what success looks like for a successful pilot. Define a time frame for that. Once you're able to, you give that startup the chance to deliver on those KPIs, you've got a clear kind of rollout plan from there. So nobody's expecting a full portfolio-wide rollout, but maybe it starts with a pilot on a building and the rollout across 5, and 5 goes to 10 if further KPIs are met, and then maybe 10 goes to 50. I think a lot of startups in this space are currently stuck at that early piloting, because either the budgets aren't there, or the processes aren't there, or they haven't yet proven the use case and the ROI. So I think defining ROI up front, having a really good process for turning pilots into rollouts is needed across the industry. So it's the technology is there. We're seeing this technology, we're investing in it, and now it's really about and a lot of pilots are also happening. It's about now pushing further. And what I'm advocating is, let's define what success looks like, and if the ROI is delivered, let's push the button on the rollout. And that's going to be transformational for the industry, because ultimately what happens is you get a high growth startup showing the classic hockey stick growth curve that you want to see in a high growth startup. You then get, of course, the benefit to the real estate owner who's deploying it, and the VCs benefit because you've got a winner in the portfolio, and then more capital pours in through our LPs into us VCs, which flows through into the startups. So it's a virtuous cycle, really. Where things get clogged up and are stuck is taking the pilots through to the rollouts. That's what's going to drive revenue growth. And then that pretty much revenue growth is kind of the trigger for the entire virtuous cycle to then flow.
Yeah, interesting. And back to the point about the humanity in it, that kind of brings it back to leadership, trust, and kind of openness, doesn't it, between parties to kind of allow some of this stuff to happen and see the benefits. And thank you for your time, Faisal. It's been awesome.
No, delighted to be here. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you for listening to the Grow Places podcast. For more information, visit growplaces.com and follow us at We Grow Places across all social channels. See you next time.